Okay, again, so welcome to second, third stop on our tour, depending on what order you wish to view these signs. They can all be looked independently or in any particular order. But for here, this is the perfect viewing platform for where the actual site, fort site is versus where it's been supposed to be and where the other fort was. There's a lot of forts in the vicinity and a lot of history going on here, which has led to the misconception over the years that Saybrook Fort had been destroyed, the first fort had been destroyed, and that it was in this particular location. So let me address that, particular part of local tradition that it was there. There was an area known as Burial Hill, a smaller hill. We have this larger rise. There was a slighter elevation you see in topographical maps. A very large elevation over where the essentially the mini golf area was, and where there was once a restaurant known as the Dock and Dine if you were a local of the area. There was a large prominence over there as well. So Burial Hill was where the English, at least, were burying some of their, people associated with the fort, along with Lady Fenwick, a local celebrity, I guess we'd say, but one of the wives of the English gentleman that came here after the Pequot War. So it was assumed her burial place on the hill was the site of the first fort. That was the first misconception. Then over time, there's confusion between the first Saybrook Fort of the Pequot War versus the second fort known as Fort Fenwick, which was destroyed when railroad construction came through in the 1870s. Behind us, you'll see the remains of the railroad turn house. It's a really interesting archaeological site. So when the railroad came through, it wiped out the fort. Much of it was spread across North Cove for the railroad causeway. So the railroad bed that you'll see across there is actually the remains of Fort Fenwick that was just spread out. So between all that confusion, the thought was the fort was here and it's destroyed. Then archaeologist by the name of Harold Julie did some work just right behind us, frankly, but never beyond, more or less where the Gardner statue was placed and where this park was going to be developed. He didn't find any 17th century artifacts, found the roundhouse behind us, and it was again thought the fort was destroyed. But I was looking at a couple famous photos and engravings of Lady Fenwick's grave, and it just kind of struck me when viewing from that direction to here, and on topographical maps, this area is always the lowest. It's much lower than there. Why would a Dutch-trained military engineer put a fort on like a lower elevation when there's higher spots? And just that alone, and understanding the Park Service would probably fund us, we're like, yeah, let's look into it. Why not? If anything, we'll be proved wrong and just look silly. But maybe if we're right, we'll learn a lot more about this important part of the Pequot War. And lo and behold, research, archaeology, landscape work, land records, a lot of stuff housed at the Old Saybrook Historical Society led us to the conclusion, and eventually field work that led us to this direction. Okay, so you got this great viewing platform and this important landform here known as Gee's Pond, believe it or not. This is known as Gee's Pond. It's this coastal wetland area. At times there was a lot more water, at times it was almost a pasture, depending on if it's cut off to access to the ebb and flow of the tidal flow of the Connecticut River. But there is, I believe, there is springs, and I think we're looking at one here. This is probably freshwater fed and one or two other spots. More than likely, this was the water supply for the fort. They had to access often, and Gardner often talks about being attacked during the war, having to do such activities. This is also a map that sort of demonstrates, when you have the time to look at it, where we believe the fort may have been, where the trading or the warehouse was. There's warehouses for goods and just supplies in general, where the original docks were. And to me, I really modeled this off of true battlefield signage that I would encounter at Gettysburg or Antietam. To me, this is like the closest one to something you would see at a full-fledged National Park Service battlefield. All the other ones are more cultural and/or specific engagements, but this ties the land to the history in many ways. So this was chosen for, I believe, its elevation, its proximity to North Cove. You'll notice there's sailboats there and boats when we go by. It's the only cove that's actually deep enough to take somewhat of a vessel. South Cove, we went by that. There's not many boats out there. It's really shallow. And I might get this wrong, but I think even today it's like 6 to 8 feet in most areas around there. You can't get a good vessel in there of any size, even an English shallop, a smaller one-sailed vessel, mast vessel, but you can get it in over there. There was these flint cobbles we found, which are ballast for English and Dutch ships. So it kind of shows where their ships were coming to dock close to the shoreline. They would offload the flint cobbles there, take on new cargo to either get up and over the Saybrook Bar or up and down the river. So an important trading area strategically. With guns set up, you can cover the entire Connecticut River and any threats that come from land. And frankly, when the English were constructing Saybrook Fort in 1635 and throughout 36, 37, they were more concerned about the Dutch or other English threats than they were about actually native threats. So this is a European design with bastions, with cannons, with redoubts that does command the Connecticut River and allowed the English to maintain a presence here when it was contested with the Dutch early on. All right, welcome to our next stop, and this is an important place and one of the well-known areas of Saybrook here. Here's the Lion Gardner Monument. Captain Lion Gardner, or lieutenant at the time, was the commander of Saybrook Fort. He was hired by John Winthrop Jr. and the proprietors to essentially establish a settlement here, a fortification and some houses for these lords and gentlemen and bigwigs in England who are expecting political crisis, foreseeing the Civil War that's coming in the near future, and we're seeing Saybrook Colony, and this is a specific colony, as like a refuge that they could escape England from. So at this time they're building a fort, they're stockpiling ordnance and guns and kind of sending it out on these ships as well, and there's conflict in the future. So at any rate, Gardner's hired, and he's expecting to be reinforced with about 100 workers and farmers, another 50 soldiers and carpenters. In the end, this venture is very underfunded, and he arrives with 20 soldiers from Massachusetts Bay, some of their family members, and in his own narrative claims there's never more than about 24 people here on site during the entire war. So they had their hands full, and that also will impact their decision on how they build Saybrook Fort. There was a plan for a really big fort with a drawbridge and all kinds of stuff. And many of our early depictions of Saybrook Fort, there's one in the town hall, reflect this description of this inventory of goods. But this fort was never created that big because they only had 20 soldiers. So we have a smaller fort with palisades, upright, sharpened sticks, probably like a shooting platform they can stand on, two bastions at least for cannons, and on the highest elevation, close to the water too, so they can protect their goods and onload, offload their ships. Not a good spot for it right here, really, and this is, again, the clues that led us to where we're going to head next. Back to the Gardner statue. The Gardner family funded this monument during the tercentennial of Connecticut in the 1630s. It may have even been about 1934, 35 when this went up. This whole landscape is artificial. It's all fill. It's been raised up. If you look over the edge, it drops down quickly into the original landscape. When in the 1960s, 70s, and then 80s, when there was discussion of building a massive kind of monument here, and actually it was plans for a very big park, which even would have like an exit off the highway, clearly never happened and probably a good thing. There was archaeology done to try to determine if there's anything left of the fort. We mentioned Harold Julie found the roundhouse. He poked around here, found fill. He didn't do much else, but he only surveyed the areas that the town owned for the park, so we can't hold it against him. Fast forward to 13, 14, when we did the survey out here, we received landholder permission, and I should say most of Old Saybrook was really supportive of this project. Almost everybody led us onto their properties to dig, and even people unconnected were begging us to come check things out, and it was great. So we did a lot of work on the point, but this entire strip behind us, as we bike up this way, all the houses on your right, everything down this gully when you look over, we pointed out from Geese Pond, going all the way back up the slope, it's gunfire. There is just upwards to probably 100, probably 60, maybe 100, various musket balls, big round balls, smaller 38, 40 caliber buckshot, which the English like to use a lot, We never found Indian arrows, and at the time Native Americans are using brass or iron arrow points, no stone. They're taking English and Dutch trade goods, cutting them up into knives and arrows and jewelry and everything else, and hair pieces. So they're recycling European goods into their own, items. Why do we find a lot of lead shot here? Again, we speculate they're getting water down to Geese Pond. They also mention having like a stockaded garden, which probably was close to the water. So maybe they're accessing what little crops they have left after the debacle at Cornfield Point getting burnt down and the guardhouse incinerated. Now they have a small, garden plot essentially, water supply, and getting ambushed at this point all the time. So in September 1636 is when the war begins, and the point here is targeted. And if we went back in time, you're probably standing where Pequot warriors would have been, and they would have been, out of musket range and maybe kind of, under the cannon so they couldn't be fired at. I should also mention in Gardner's narrative, he gives enough landscape descriptions that once we kind of figured out where we thought the fort was, everything started to sink and we could triangulate. They talk about going to the garden pales, which is a stockaded garden, and that they had to go under or go down to get to the garden. And every time they did that, they had to send guards because the guns of the fort couldn't protect them. And to me, this is like the only down slope really around here that would fit that. Even if you had the fort here, there's not a lot of any kind of land that fits that description. It just kind of all fits. Also, as I'll talk about later when we get up to the fort, Gardner also mentions a small rising hill on the point. And lo and behold, there is a small hill that shows up on topographical maps in the 1850s up to the 1970s until the landholder had it graveled out for whatever reason. So it's gone now, but we found the outline of it and we found artifacts around it. So that helped further triangulate the fort site that we're going to go to next. And then ultimately it was those different clues, it was the height of the land up that way, where we believe the warehouses were, North Cove where the ships can come and go, where the flint ballast was found. This is all the clues to this huge mystery that we put together to build this case. It all points to that area up there and for so many reasons. Now we might not be 100% correct, but this is our best guess to date. Sometime in the future, hopefully some technology will just be able to, scan from, space and find all this stuff. But as of yet, I mean, we really stand by in the Historical Society, this new fort site that you'll be among the first to check out, next. Yeah, Doug, come over here. We'll just spread people out on both sides of the road. All right, welcome to the next stop, and an incredibly important stop on our tour. This is, to our best estimate, the Saybrook Fort site, the first Saybrook Fort site underlying Gardner of the Pequot War era. As you notice coming up here a little bit, there was a slight incline. I'm kind of looking down it now. It's not that perceptible, but on early topographical maps and well into the 1800s, this is detailed or described as more of a rising hill with another hill not too far off that I mentioned a little earlier. As I was mentioning, this was the center of town up through the Revolution for the most part. Easy access to shipping and the water, fisheries, onwards and so forth. And it's no coincidence, it was also, probably just an offshoot of the early fortifications here as well. So describing Saybrook Fort, in the course of our research, we did find a new document which described the fort at the time of the war being made of red oak, which was prevalent around here. Turns out it was a pretty soft material that would deteriorate. By 1647, most of the fort was in shambles. But red oak palisade, maybe 15, 20 feet tall, then probably built up around the palisade on the inside, a shooting step, gravel, and more wood so you could get sentries up over. 2 bastions, probably one in my estimate, aimed towards the river, one aimed towards the neck itself so you can defend both water and land. There's only any reference to about 2 cannons, no matter what, all the time during the Pequot War. 2 demi-culvers, they call them, big, at the time, 12-pound guns that were able to shoot clean across the river. And again, in terms of the archaeological excavations, we did a bunch of test pitting, a bunch of metal detecting, a bunch of survey work, and found a lot of military objects and trade objects closer to the water. But no physical remains of the fort. What we did find is where we're standing, quite a bit of fill has been brought in. several meters in a couple areas. Okay, back to the archaeological excavations we did around here. A lot of test pitting, a lot of metal detecting, and most all the artifacts, or the most intact land I should say, was pretty much behind us on the slope going back down to the water. Some of these front yards yielded artifacts, but there's been so much occupation around here, from natives to Dutch, and then the English, and then it's been the center of town, 1700s, and a busy spot, 1800s, so there's artifacts everywhere.
You'll find a sweet spot. You'll at least plant seeds after? Or you just kind of live?
So here we are at the part of town known as Saybrook Neck, and it's called that for a good reason. We are at the skinniest point on this narrow of land that connects the point to the mainland. You can look on that side, north and south I should say, you'll see water on both sides. Very narrow area right here. This main stretch has probably historically always been used by native peoples, and then thereafter the Dutch and the English to access your cornfields by going down present-day Maple, right? You walk from the fort all the way up here, head on down. We saw that part of the battlefield earlier, unless you're going to access point south through South Cove. North Cove that we came by, again, one of the deeper areas that you could actually get shipping in, some lighter stuff, smaller stuff. And here is one of the few fully identified battlefield actions of this entire siege. So here at the Neck on February 22nd, 1637, very significant action occurred in the siege and battle of Saybrook Fort. Lyon Gardner took out a detachment of, I believe, about 12 men at this point, which at that was almost 3/4 of the existing garrison still. And they marched up this way to burn reeds, as we can see, and to cut down timber that they were going to float through North Cove down towards the fort. Probably some of those red oaks that they were using for construction materials for the fort, the palisade. The Pequot always had warriors here keeping an eye on the English. It was a constant state of siege. So this was a perfect point for an ambush, far enough away from the fort, not many places to go if you're going to retreat. There's only one way in, one way out. This is one of the better documented parts of this battle. There's at least 3 different accounts from people that were there, or military reports written afterwards. Where we're standing, Lyon Gardner put 2 sentries here with guns ready to protect the other workers that were cutting trees, burning reeds. And as they moved out to start doing their work, they spooked, quote unquote, some Indians in the reeds when they burned them. But that was the bait right there, right? So 2 Pequot warriors rush out of the reeds and start running that direction north into this neck of land right behind us here, in front of us, I should say. Gardner gives chase along with other soldiers. They see an easy target, they run after these Indians, and they're sucked into an ambush. So the English were easily drawn off of the neck down into that sort of peninsula where Gardner said all of a sudden they were encompassed by about 60 Indians, more or less. So a major detachment of Pequot were waiting for them. They took the bait, they ran down into there and then started getting hammered. Immediately one guy fell dead, shot multiple times with arrows. At that point, the English come running up here, shooting their guns as much as they can. The sentries are trying to cover them, but there's about, at this point now, 10 soldiers being rushed by about 60 Indians. They also had 2 dogs of war, they write, big massive mastiffs, big English mastiff hounds that were used for flushing out Indians or for attack animals. They too were probably killed immediately. The natives were really terrified of those beasts. And then right behind us, we found gun parts of flintlock arms, and more than likely carried by the sentries or the retreating English. There's an X-ray image of one right here when you have a time to look. It's a spring from the flash pan of the flintlock, which would have rendered the gun inoperable right there. So at any rate, Gardner and his men are now retreating as fast as they can back up the neck, and they write that the Pequots are running through the reeds trying to get in front of them to cut them off here at the neck, so then they will be trapped. They also said they're attacking them in a crescent formation, like always trying to encompass them as they're fighting. And they said, Gardner said that this is the only time he ever mentions God in all of his writings. Most of the people are very religious, but he's like, God drove me to order my men to draw their swords or we all would have been taken. Because they also mentioned the Indians were running up to the muzzles of their muskets, not allowing them to reload. So this is close quarter combat right now. So the English are fighting hand to hand, running as fast as they can, wounded. Most of these guys have multiple arrows in them right now. But many of these soldiers have body armor. It's actually a heavy leather jacket known as a buff coat, which could, slow down the hits. It wouldn't be, fatal. But most of the men that did die were shot in the legs, the arms, the neck, the head kind of stuff around here. So in metal detecting and surveying this entire neck here, we found most of the artifacts on the south side. And we believe the English were retreating along the trail, which was probably on this side, which is the higher part of the neck. All these houses are built on this side, the older ones, because this is the highest point. So probably they were running this way, shooting that way. So we find lead shot going south into the reeds and into the backyards of all these houses as the English are running, reloading, and trying to get back to the fort. So in this engagement, Gardner lost of those 10 men. I did the math. It was something like about 6 were killed in action or wounded and captured. Another 4 made it back. 2 men dropped their guns and just ran before anything even happened. So he threatened to execute them, but he didn't because he needed the men afterwards. And Gardner himself was shot something like a half dozen times. It took him a couple days to recover. So they got close enough back to the fort that the guns could protect them, the cannons. They were cutting down trees to clear fields of fire up there. We followed artifacts all the way up the neck and then towards Church Street and down Church Street until essentially our grant ran out. So the artifacts were going right back towards the spot that we believe Saybrook Fort was. So again, another bit of evidence. All these bits of evidence all lead to the area we believe the fort was. So that's, we don't have that one silver bullet, but we have, a lot of supporting evidence, So this is basically our research process. But this here's incredible that it's one of the most documented parts of the war in terms of, historical documentation. And what's the chances we could ever find anything out here? And it turned out to be one of the more rich areas of the research we've done. So we actually have we have tracked how far in the English got in that peninsula before the fighting starts. We can see them retreat back. We have broken gun parts, buttons dropped on this side, bullets going into the south slope on that side. It's pretty intense. And you look at the place, you'd think this has been fully developed, but all it takes is just small, intact pieces of land to tell the story. I have, about where that bird is over there right now, I dug a musket ball out of the ground years ago, 10 years ago. So I'm sure there's still more lead shot in here. This is a really important part of the battlefield. After the war is over, a palisade is put up across the neck here. It's known as the gate or the palisade to the neck, because it is the smallest part, and it is important if you're going to defend, I guess, the rest of town from any land-based attack. So I encourage you to really take a good look at the signage, to really look around and get a feel of the landscape. It's one of the better areas that you can really imagine things if you put your mind to it. Well, welcome to the General William Hart House, the headquarters of the Old Saybrook Historical Society, and what essentially is serving as our orientation panel for the siege and battles of Saybrook Fort, biking, walking / auto tour, whatever you would like to partake. And with all the signage that we tried to keep standard, have it kind of like a standard brand you would see throughout town, this here orients you to all phases of the story, giving a visitor that might not have any other knowledge of, or maybe their first of the war, or maybe it's their first time ever visiting Saybrook. If you come to the historical William Hart House as part of this historical sort of tourism kind of effort, you'll inevitably see this, and points you out to the fact that there's going to be other signs like this throughout town and where to find them. All the artifacts are housed in the Stevens Archives next door as well. Exhaustive literature, both from researchers in town and historians in the past, and our technical report as well. If this really interests you that much that you want to read the archaeological report, there's a copy in the reading room as well. So this is sort of the one-stop shopping, for the 17th century, beginning here in the Hart House. we hope that other communities will sort of repeat this or emulate this model. They might not have the same sort of richness of sites that Saybrook has, but you know, if we link them all throughout the state, you could have a real, you know, statewide Pequot War tour in various communities. So Saybrook is a great model for this effort. I'd again like to thank the Historical Society for organizing the signage, the bike tour, the efforts to study Gardner, and the role of Saybrook Fort during the Pequot War. So thanks very much, and you know, enjoy the tour.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.